Céline Dion.
My dream to be international star.
Could it happen again? Could Celine Dion happen again?
I'm Thomas Leblanc, and Celine Understood is a 4-part series from CBC Podcasts and CBC News, where I piece together the surprising circumstances that helped manufacture Celine Dion, the pop icon. Celine Understood, available wherever you get your podcasts.
Frequency Podcast Network. Stories that matter, podcasts that resonate.
He's in the building!
Drink the moment. Drink it.
I said empty your mind.
Coquettish and coy. Ow. Ow.
What?
There's people that are dying.
The wickedly talented.
More than great. It was historic.
Crack is
Wow.
Oh, good for you.
I have to apologize.
One of the hottest.
Hello, and welcome back to The Reheat, a podcast that re-examines the spiciest celebrity news and scandals of yesteryear and asks, how would we react to the same events if they transpired today? I'm your co-host, Sadaf.
And I'm your other co-host, Sarah Sahagian. And today we are going to dive deep into the drama and the intrigue behind American presidential politics. As the old adage goes, politics is just business for less attractive people. And while we don't necessarily agree that politicians can't be hot, we do agree that there's lots of drama to be found in government. Today, we are going to look at 4 shocking U.S. presidential news stories. Well, kind of. Okay, not really. We're starting with perhaps the biggest story in American political history, the assassination of President Abraham Lincoln, which, to be fair, we don't talk enough about in modern times, except for that wonderful Apple show I loved, Manhunt. Sadaf, what do you think of when you consider the assassination of Abraham Lincoln? What comes to mind for you?
First of all, I need to do Manhunt. As you know, I love Apple TV shows. I need to get on it. You recommended it to me. Honestly, I don't know much, which is maybe not great. What I always think of, though, is that he allegedly kind of anticipated his assassination, which I find really fascinating. I don't know if it's actually true, though.
I mean, he'd had death threats. That's the thing that was true. So it was, of course, on his radar. But I don't think he was anticipating being assassinated that night, or I don't think he would have gone. I mean, some people didn't think he should go to the theater because it was very public, but he didn't seem to be on higher alert than normal, in my opinion. But that's just my opinion as sort of an amateur historian.
No, I think it's fascinating, and I don't want to end up on a list for saying this, but I love an interesting assassination story, and this was the one that kicked them all off. So, and you know, honestly, in the political time we're in now, which we will get to for the record, that's why we're doing this, I think it's especially interesting to look back.
This is the oldest story we've ever reheated, actually, on our show, so it's a momentous occasion.
Wow, okay, look at that. Okay, get into it, Sarah. Tell us.
So President Abraham Lincoln was shot at D.C.'s Ford's Theater on April 14th, 1865, just days after the Civil War ended. He was out that night seeing a popular stage show called Our American Cousin with his wife, Mary Todd Lincoln. This was a highly publicized date night because the fact that Lincoln was planning on seeing the play was even published in the papers that morning. During a funny scene in the comedy, B-list stage actor John Wilkes Booth ran into Lincoln's box, shot him in the head, then jumped onto the stage below, where he shouted Virginia's Latin motto, but I'm going to translate it into English, "Thus always to tyrants."
Ooh.
It's probably obvious by now that Wilkes Booth was not a fan of Lincoln and was devastated when the South lost the Civil War. So while there were people present who attempted to rush the stage, some shouting, hang him, about John Wilkes Booth, he escaped and he got away from the theater that night. Lincoln would ultimately die hours later across the street in a boarding house bed that, according to lore, and there's some evidence about this, it was a bed where John Wilkes Booth had once taken a nap. So that's really weird.
That is really odd and creepy.
It is really creepy. So the story here, I mean, it's tragic because it's an assassination. it led to a lot of strife for America, but it's also really salacious, right? Like, just these details are so creepy and weird and stick with you.
Oh, 100%. The whole thing is it feels very tabloidy in an interesting way, and it feels modern, but I guess that's the thing. Any kind of political maneuver like this is always going to feel relatively timeless because politics feel like they are the same cycle repeating again and again and again.
So one thing we need to remember when we talk about the assassination of Lincoln is that this was the first time in American history that a president had been assassinated. So there had basically never been a story this big in America since they won the War of Independence, the Revolutionary War, right? Like,
yeah.
That since then, this was pretty much the biggest news story. I mean, obviously, the Civil War was a huge news story. The end of the Civil War was a huge news story. These were unprecedented times, right? So you can just imagine people were reeling from a war that tore the country apart. Then it ended. That was huge news. You kind of feel like you're in the denouement of that conflict. And then the president is straight up assassinated.
It's pretty wild, and it's also interesting because the media obviously worked so differently at that time. I mean, it certainly existed, but it wasn't the way it is now. You didn't have cell phones, you didn't have social media, you didn't have computers, you didn't have internet. So things moved at a different pace, and they were certainly reported differently, which I bet that TV show gets into. I hope it does, because I would love to see more about how the media side worked and operated at that time.
And we will get into that. So after the assassination, there was an epic 12-day manhunt for Booth. The New York Times headline announcing the assassination of Lincoln read, "Awful event. President Lincoln is shot by an assassin." I feel like this is actually a pretty understated headline. Sadaf, do you think the writing of the press coverage would be more sensational today?
Yes, awful event. I mean, what else could they say? They could have said catastrophic. That's far too long for a newspaper. I think today we'd even just say Lincoln shot, Lincoln murdered, and that would be it, and that would be good enough, and maybe an exclamation mark or two, which you still don't really see. This is like a cover of The Sun. It's so funny to me.
It's just, I mean, I guess, how do you encapsulate in a headline how horrific this was? Fair enough, right? Maybe awful event is the best they could do. I don't know. Maybe they had a really long debate about the adjective they used. I'm not sure. But when I first read this, it came to mind, that meme, that very demure, very mindful, where I was like, oh, this isn't sensationalistic the way we are today in our news coverage. Like, it's just, you're just explaining what happened without a lot of spin.
I love that. You're so right. But I really do, I'm sitting here as you're talking and I'm thinking, what word could they have used that wouldn't take up too many characters that would really capture this? And I really don't know. Maybe awful really is good enough. I mean, it does add a sense of comedy to the whole thing. I'm so sorry, again, to imply that any of this was funny. It certainly wasn't, but it's fascinating.
I know. Well, I mean, I feel like today it might have been something like, Lincoln shot, is America over?
Ooh.
Right? Something like that, right? Is this the end of America?
That's good.
I feel like there would have been more of a sense of doom in the headlines, right? And I understand people were very worried. They were worried for the fate of America. But these headlines didn't really editorialize. They were what they were supposed to be. They just sort of described events, which really does show you how journalism has changed for so many reasons. And I'm not blaming journalists or even editors or newspapers. It's hard out there, right? This was when print was king, right? This was when newspapers were the only game in town. You had to buy your newspapers. Lots of people made huge fortunes by selling newspapers. I mean, I've seen Newsies, even the people who sold them did pretty well.
Yeah, that's the thing. You would have to buy it just to know what was going on. And that was kind of the beginning and end of it. Omar clearly concurs. Omar would have taken a far more drastic approach, I'm sure.
And I also think that now people are more desensitized, right? If you're trying to grab someone's attention away from TikTok with your headlines, obviously it needs to be a little bit more sensational because the print media is competing with more. So back then you weren't competing with anything. You were competing with maybe like someone might have had a copy of the Bible in their home.
That's
You're
such a
competing
good
with
point.
the story of Noah's Ark. That's your competition, which is a good story.
Yes, it is. It is. That's a great point. And I mean, listen, that is the main reason we sensationalize today. It's for clicks. It's always for clicks. That's the big reason. You want to be the one who gets it first, who gets it right, sure, but especially who gets it good. You know, you want all the color. And this headline certainly would not probably have me picking it up if there was another one right next to it that had a far more salacious headline. That's just the truth. We are basic people.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's absolutely right. And there are reasons why media history is the way it is and why the media has evolved. It's just funny to go back in time and read these headlines that just feel so quaint, right?
100%. And we'll link to it too in the description below if you want to take a look at some of the old tabloid coverage, quote unquote, of the Lincoln assassination.
As I mentioned earlier, Booth was an actor. In fact, he was part of a family of famous theater actors.
Oh, wow.
And in the era before movies, theater was a popular form of entertainment. Booth's dad, Junius Brutus Booth, which I love that name, so theatrical.
What a name, seriously.
He immigrated to America from England and became one of the most acclaimed and popular actors of his lifetime. So, I mean, he wasn't quite the Daniel Day-Lewis of the stage in America, but I mean, he was pretty close. He was one of the top few performers. I would say he was kind of like maybe like a less famous, more respected George Clooney.
Wow. Okay. So then that's another reason this would be front page news. I mean, obviously, you know, the president's gone, but yes, this is another big story I'd want to dig into.
Yeah, it's like, okay, let's put it this way. It's like if Casey Affleck had shot the president.
Whoa. Okay, that's pretty insane, actually. Wow.
And I mean, okay, obviously, I mean, John Wilkes Booth. I hate Casey Affleck as a person, but John Wilkes Booth was not as talented as Casey Affleck. However, he probably had the 1800s version of Casey Affleck's fame.
Oh, sure. That's so fascinating, though, to think about it that way. Wow. Okay, so tell us more.
So Booth's brother Edwin was also a famous and well-respected actor, and the family widely regarded him as the one who would carry on his father's legacy. They kind of thought that John was not very talented. He didn't have the acting chops. He was seen as pretty mediocre, but he did do stunts, and you know, he made the theater a bit of a spectacle, which earned him a reputation as an early version of kind of like a cheesy action star. So think Jean-Claude Van Damme, but for the 1860s.
What a hilarious family. This is so kooky, all of this.
Yeah, well, this is why it was such a huge story. And I think when we talk about the assassination of Lincoln, we don't really emphasize how famous John Wilkes Booth was or how famous his family was. And that was an element. Like, this was also a celebrity gossip story, not just a political gossip story. This was show business and politics, which are both very theatrical, colliding.
And we're going to see more of that as we talk over a few other scandals, too.
Absolutely. So Booth spent much of his life in the South, growing up on a farm in Maryland. Maryland was a border state near D.C., and while enslaving humans had been legal there, Maryland did not secede from the Union and was not part of the Confederacy during the Civil War. So it's in this sort of gray area politically. Some of his family felt more of a connection to the North, but Booth believed he was Confederate at heart. And this might be because his family forced him to spend much of his acting years performing in the South. They wanted him to perform south of the Mason-Dixon line since they felt he was less talented than his father and brother. And so they wanted to reserve the most prestigious northern theaters in places like, you know, Boston, New York, for the more talented members of their family.
Ouch, yeah. He had reasons to be resentful.
Yeah. So there's drama in his family as well. The story just gets more and more fascinating. I mean, it's horrific, but it's certainly interesting. So, Sadaf, does John Wilkes Booth sound thirsty AF? Do you get the impression that while he had vile Confederate beliefs, one of his main motivations in assassinating Lincoln may well have been just wanting attention?
I have thought about this because it's so interesting, and now knowing that his family was also so considerably more skilled than he was, more popular, more famous. I do wonder if this was kind of like his bid for that big moment, that big spectacle, and to put on a little bit of a show. I know that yet again might sound so callous for what actually happened, but I feel like it has to play an element here. No, what do you think, Sarah?
Well, I'm not a psychologist, but this person sounds at the very least like a huge narcissist. So I think you're right. I think that he didn't really get respect as an actor. I mean, he made a living, he was famous. Lay people appreciated him, right? If you wanted to have a good time, you might take your wife out to see him perform, right? Kind of the way you might see a Marvel movie today, right? Like,
Yeah.
this is not, if you really want to think, you're going to go see Conclave. If you don't, maybe you're going to go see, the new Ant-Man, right? Like,
Yeah.
he was kind of like Ant-Man. Let's think about it that
Ooh,
way.
Ouch.
And I think maybe he wanted more respect, more acclaim, more prestige. And what is a more important moment in the history of the 19th century than this? I mean, he did go down in history. I think that if you feel like, okay, I'm a flash in the pan, I'm relatively successful as a working actor, but I'm not going to be remembered in history like my brother and father are, well, what do you do to eclipse them?
You killed the
assassinate
president.
the president. That is an option. I don't want to be flippant, but I feel like that might have been just what tipped the scale and made him want to do this. He also really did believe in the Confederacy. I do have to say that. He was a true believer, but there were lots of people who were true believers who didn't decide to just forfeit their lives and give up everything by assassinating the president.
It's so wild. You would think that there were other options available to him to win a little bit of glory, but I guess this was the one. And hey, I don't know who his dad and his brother are. He achieved that.
Well, that's true. And I mean, he really did make it so that they were kind of persona non grata, right?
Yeah.
Like, his brother's life was much harder because of him.
Yeah.
And I mean, I don't know that much about his brother. I don't know that much about his beliefs, but I do know that there was a lot of guilt by association, and he had to have a bodyguard at one point. So
Oh, wow.
if he really didn't like his brother and a lot of this was sibling rivalry, well, he won the rivalry.
Yeah, for sure.
So around 1,000 soldiers joined in the manhunt for John Wilkes Booth. This was unprecedented because, remember, an American president had never been assassinated before, and the war had literally just ended. People thought there would finally be calm and peace. After a manhunt that really went on for 12 days, Booth was ultimately found hiding out in a barnyard near Port Royal, Virginia. The soldiers set the barn ablaze to get him to come out and then shot him when he did. Wilkes died of those gunshot wounds, but his conspirators did stand trial because, yes, there were people who worked with him to make the assassination happen and help him hide afterwards. And we could do an entire episode just on those conspirators. That trial became a national obsession as well. But we don't really have time to get into it now. So, Sadaf, is there any story in the 21st century in American politics that can rival the drama of the 19th century equivalent of Jean-Claude Van Damme murdering the president?
I think it's such a good question. And you know what's wild? I really do think quite a few scandals came into comparison, but we tend to forget how wild this one is. Maybe because, as we said earlier, the media didn't sensationalize it to the extent that they probably could have. We just don't have as much material. But honestly, I don't know. I still think the Clinton and Lewinsky scandal is up there. Watergate is up there. 9/11 is up there. The entire Bush family is up there. This is the wild thing, and this is why we had to do this episode. There are so many American political scandals. Like, you could spend a lifetime going over it and really digging through it all. So the fact that this is kind of what kicked it off is funny to me in a weird way. Like, this was just kind of, in some ways, I really do think it's on the smaller end, which might be a ridiculous thing to say. What do you think, Sarah?
Well, you don't have to debate it. It's pretty cut and dry. You're not supposed to assassinate a democratically elected president, right? Yep. And that is how I think the media really responded to it, right? This is a crime. We're not going to debate whether it was okay. With something like Monica Lewinsky and Bill Clinton, there was a lot of debate over whether this was a big deal, whether we should care. There's a lot of sex involved, so it was particularly salacious. This is just it's pretty cut and dry. I mean, the details are ridiculous, right?
Right.
It's almost hard to believe that this happened, right?
Yes.
That this B-list famous actor killed Lincoln, was able to evade capture for 12 days while 1,000 people looked for him, right? There was a conspiracy to commit this assassination. All of it doesn't, I mean, that today we think of conspiracies as being like QAnon being made up, but this was a real conspiracy in American history. So it's almost too ridiculous to believe, but you're right. Compared to the sex scandals of later years, it feels, I don't want to use the word quaint again, and I don't think that's really the word, but it feels more dignified, right? It's awful. It's terrible what happened, but there isn't the sort of seediness of a sex scandal.
Yes. And I love sex in my scandals. I have to say, I think most of us do, but I think you completely nailed it. And on that note, I hate to make this the segue, but I think it's time to dive into a little bit of Trump, who is our current asshole in residence, I think, Sarah.
So the second presidential scandal I will be discussing today is a very 21st century presidential scandal.
You know,
I started with the oldest scandal we've ever tackled, and now I'm going to go to something much more recent. In fact, we're breaking our 10-year rule. Normally, we only tackle things that happened 10 years ago or later, but because this was so huge, we're breaking that rule. This is from the 2016 presidential election. So there are many problematic issues we could discuss when the name Donald Trump comes up. The fact that he arguably encouraged sedition on January 6th, his Islamophobic politics, his racist comments about people, and the fact that he became the first former president to be indicted after he left office and has now been indicted multiple times. Today we will
impeached multiple times. It's insane.
Yep. Honestly, there are so many things we could talk about. Nobody has had more scandals than Donald Trump. Today, we will focus on the infamous and upsetting grab him by the pussy tape, which is just one of his scandals. But you have to just pick one. There are too many. In U.S. politics, there is often an October surprise. So that's the term that the media uses to refer to a news story that comes out in the month before the election that has the power to change the results. So when a tape of then Republican nominee Donald Trump confessing to grabbing women by the pussy without consent was leaked on October 7th, 2016, many of us just assumed that this was the October surprise. It would cement a victory for Hillary Clinton. The resurfaced tape, which can be viewed easily online if you want to see it, and if it's triggering for you, absolutely, there's no pressure. You don't have to watch it. It features a 2005 conversation between Trump and Billy Bush. In the video, Trump brags about how being famous allows him to assault women. He tells Bush that if he sees a woman he finds attractive, quote, I just start kissing them. Consent doesn't seem to come into it for him. He adds, it's like a magnet, just kiss. I don't even wait. And when you're a star, they let you do it. You can do anything. Grab them by the pussy. So, Sadaf, where were you when this tape came out? And what was your reaction to it?
Oh, God. You know what's so disturbing? I mean, I didn't realize this was almost a decade ago. It feels like it was just yesterday because Trump really has not left us alone. The fact that the words grab them by the pussy has become a part of our lexicon, especially in the media, where even just being a woman, being an anchor, being in front of a camera, people will still run past you and scream this at you. I just find so foul. I was actually working at a newspaper at the time, and I remember this didn't explode quite the way you would think in the newsroom at the time. We were definitely all, I think, laughing about it. I think we were all like, oh, that's so wild. At that time, you have to remember, no one was really quite taking seriously that this man would go as far as he did. It was, to use a previous term of yours, Sarah, a quaint moment, really. I mean, it was horrible, it was disgusting, it was foul, but just in context and in relevance to what's happened since then with this man, it's so odd to me that that's where we started. We never could have predicted how far things have come.
I also want to point out that you would have been in a newsroom in Toronto where we'd already had politician Rob Ford said that he had more than enough pussy to eat at home during a news conference.
Correct.
So it might have been a bit of a desensitized environment because we'd also had a political scandal relating to women's genitalia.
You're so right. And the funny thing was, like, there were some American reports at the time that they were going to have a politician like us. LOL. And
Yeah.
yet again, we are repeating the cycle now. God.
Yeah. So after this happened, I mean, it could have been the October surprise that lost him the election, but I actually think this was never going to happen. I think that there were so many people who just didn't care and didn't think this was a big deal. But after the news story came out, Trump and his team decided that the best defense is a good offense. He downplayed the tape as, quote, locker room talk. We have heard that phrase too many times since 2016. It just won't die. And he didn't view it as a confession of sexual assault. During his October 9th debate with Hillary Clinton, he invited Paula Jones, who accused Bill Clinton of sexual misconduct in the 1990s, to the debate. And that was all part of Trump's strategy to distract from his own misdeeds. I don't think he cares at all about how Paula Jones suffered. And I do believe that she experienced sexual misconduct at the hands of Bill Clinton. But this was just him taking a vulnerable person who had been made a mockery of in the press for years and using her as a prop. It's just gross. And so in the debate, he focused on how Bill Clinton had been, quote, abusive to women, which isn't wrong, but at that time, Bill Clinton wasn't running for president.
No.
It was his wife, who has not been accused of sexual assault.
Right.
And I'm not going to sit here and say that Hillary Clinton is a perfect person without fault, but the truth is she has never been accused of anything similar to what Trump has done or to what Bill has done. So, Sadaf, what do you think of the strategy to defend one's reputation by focusing on the misdeeds of Hillary Clinton's husband?
Listen, I want to say, I mean, a lot of Trump's strategy at the time and continues to be quite diluted. But here's the thing. I also think that it was going to be tough for Hillary to run and to not have her husband's shadow looming over her. It was an easy piece for Trump to play and to use. And God knows it certainly was heard by people and made an impact. And it was an easy way to target her. I think it was always tough for this woman to be able to make a case for herself. And we're going to get into that a little bit more later in this episode. But I don't know that she could have avoided it. I think what sucks is that this was, and by mind you, again, I'm not a big Hillary fan myself. She's certainly a smart woman, though. And her having to stand there and debate with a fool like this, I don't know. The whole thing just sounds like some kind of torture. Honestly, like, this is a mockery of politics and the political system. And maybe that alone says plenty about the political system. Maybe it needs to be criticized and torn apart. I think it does, particularly in the US. But this was just a joke. This whole thing was a joke.
It was a joke. And one thing that I found really interesting was I rewatched the debate, the October 9th, 2016 debate. And Hillary is an amazing debater. She's so poised in the face of debating with this buffoon who's really going below the belt. He's saying all these personal things about her, mining her trauma. And I was comparing that to the 2020 debate between Biden and Trump. And, you know, Biden does a good job and he won, but he's not nearly as good. Like, you can tell he gets frustrated with Trump.
Oh, yeah.
And people seem to like that about him, actually. People seem to like that at certain points. He just sort of gets frustrated and says things under his breath. But I just think it's interesting that no one has ever debated Trump more effectively, really, than Clinton, who just always stayed focused, and she still didn't win. But Biden, who has had his share of scandals and was arguably, you know, no more qualified to be president than Hillary Clinton, he was able to beat him in 2020. So you definitely see a gendered bias.
Oh, yeah. And also, Hillary certainly had experience having a idiot husband president at home for a long time, who I'm sure she had a lot of arguments and debates with over time. This is a woman who bided her time really, really, really intensely. She waited for this point.
Yeah.
So if she wasn't going to kill it in the debate, that would be disappointing. I'm not surprised that she was so adept. And I also think when you have an opponent like Trump, it just makes you look smarter. There's no way you won't.
I mean, that is fair. It does make her look smarter. Like, when we think about the people that Barack Obama had to debate, he had more formidable opponents. He had like Mitt Romney and John McCain, people who actually can debate.
Yes.
So there isn't that level of contrast. Like, Obama is a great debater, but he's not debating with idiots, right?
Right.
He's debating with dignified people whose policies he disagrees with.
Yeah, and debating is a skill on its own. Like, to say what you will about whoever's policies and how you believe in them and what kind of politician they are, but Sarah knows this better than anybody. Debating is really, really, really its own skill, its own trait. And yeah, I think she definitely stood apart during this time.
She's a fantastic debater, and the reason why I think people didn't appreciate that and this didn't lead to a decisive victory for her is that the world lacks debate literacy, which is something I'm passionate about and I will talk about later. In a future episode, I can talk more about debate literacy, but I think the public didn't realize that she had won the debate.
Yes.
Because debating is a skill and watching debate is also a skill, just like media literacy is important. So after the Grab 'em by the Pussy tapes leaked, it did look like Trump was suffering in the polls, that this might actually be the big October surprise and would lead to a decisive Clinton victory. For example, famed data analyst Nate Silver gave Hillary Clinton a 71.4% chance of winning. And since then, he's actually been very defensive about that and said, like, that doesn't mean that you're going to win. It just means you're more likely to win. And and that's fair. I do understand statistics are much more complicated than most of us realize. Like, I'm not a professional statistician. But it now looks like, among other problems, there was a major Bradley effect that reared its ugly head and skewed poll results. So the phenomenon, the Bradley effect, is named after former LA Mayor Tom Bradley, who was also Black. In California's 1982 gubernatorial election, polls suggested Bradley would win. But the person elected was ultimately an Armenian like me and a white man, George Dugmajian. He was white. The theory is that, okay, when pollsters call you, one person is more socially desirable. Maybe they're more qualified. Maybe their policies are more progressive and you should be voting for them. And people in your peer group would want you to vote for them, but you're not going to because maybe you're racist, maybe you're sexist, lots of reasons like that. And so you lie to the pollsters, right? You just are embarrassed to confess to the pollsters who you're actually voting for. And this is the Bradley effect. And so people posit that this is what happened when they did polls about Hillary Clinton versus Donald Trump. Everyone knew that you should be voting for Hillary Clinton. She was more experienced. Donald Trump had really racist and transphobic and just horrific policies. He had sexually assaulted people. There was no good reason to vote for Trump other than, well, I mean, you like his horrific policies and also you hate women. Right. So people speculate now that there was a lot of lying to pollsters, right? Because people were embarrassed even to say to a pollster they didn't know on the phone that they planned on voting for Donald Trump. So that's called the Bradley effect. And if you look at the results right now of polls, this has me worried for Kamala Harris and just really drives home the importance of everyone going to vote. If you want Kamala Harris to win, you need to go out and vote. You can't depend on other people to vote. Every vote counts, especially I can only imagine what the Bradley effect is like, how much more intense it is for a racialized woman.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I believe this show comes out on election day in the US. So if you're listening to this, if it's the morning, get out there, please go vote. And I know that there's no perfect candidate here, but there's certainly a better candidate. And let's not let this cycle repeat. For the love of God, please. I do worry that it might.
I worry it does. But you know what? Even though she's not a perfect candidate, neither was Joe Biden. And people were willing to vote for him. So I do think that we have to call out the sexism and the racism here, right? Where if you are a woman, and in this case, a woman of color, you have to be perfect in order to escape criticism. And yes, Kamala Harris has done some things that I really, really disagree with. But so has Joe Biden. And I didn't really see many people entertaining the possibility that you should just stay home and vote for neither candidate.
Right. I completely agree. We're rooting for Kamala here, in case you haven't realized. And so if you haven't put your vote in for her and you want to, please get up and do it. Don't just count on everybody else to do that. Your vote counts. Your vote matters. As they say, if you're in line, stay in line, for the love of God.
Stay in line and grab your friends too. Don't just go vote yourself. And I know this is a big burden to put on people, right? And I completely appreciate that this shouldn't have to be anyone's responsibility, but there's a lot at stake here. So call your friends, text them, encourage them to stay in line. Go with your friends and then get Starbucks and chat in line. Make it like a coffee date with your friends. Make it fun so that you stay in that line.
Amen. Amen.
Listen to our podcast in the line.
Yes. We'll keep you
right?
company.
We've got lots of older episodes. Listen to
yeah.
our archive, other podcasts as well, right? Just do whatever you have to do to make it fun. And I know it can be hard to vote. Some people have to wait in line for so long that they end up having to leave because they've got to pick their kids up from school or do other things like that. I get that it can be hard. But I mean, take your kids to vote with you. Bring the iPad, right? Let them have screen time and just
do what you got to do. And the same thing goes for when the Canadian election rolls around, which is not too far from now. And we've got a similar character to Trump in the running. So we're going to yell this at you all over again, this time to the Canadians. So please do what you got to do.
Absolutely. Vote and get your friends and family to vote as well. Well, the story of Hillary Clinton's 2016 loss is definitely an important cautionary tale. So we've talked to you about why you need to vote, why we want everyone to vote when it's the Canadian election. But now we're going to take a quick break before we return with more salacious presidential stories.
Céline Dion.
My dream, to be international star.
Could it happen again? Could Celine Dion happen again?
I'm Thomas Leblanc, and Celine Understood is a 4-part series from CBC Podcasts and CBC News, where I piece together the surprising circumstances that helped manufacture Celine Dion, the pop icon. Celine Understood, available wherever you get your podcasts.
And we're back. Okay, Sarah, I want to begin with Dear Bill Clinton. I know we've touched on him a little bit, but I want to go a little bit deeper. For a significant while, I have to admit, prior to Obama, I actually considered him the hottest president. I'm embarrassed to say that. Yeah. Sarah's giving me that look. Eyebrows raised. Okay. I'm embarrassed. I'm embarrassed to say it. He's a very bloodless looking individual. He's got very thin lips, if he has lips at all. But anyway, I retroactively apologize. I'm so sorry I felt this way. I don't know. Maybe there's something about a man and a saxophone. I can't explain myself, but I regret it. Let's get into a little bit of why. So here's a little background in case you're not too familiar with Good William here. He was the U.S. president from 1993 to 2001. He was a Democrat or New Democrat, depending on who you ask, and had previously served as the governor of Arkansas. While generally he's considered to have a better presidency just overall compared to all the others we've had so far, his personal life has made it muddy. Just, that's about as diplomatic as I can get. He was embroiled in so many scandals during his heyday, namely, of course, his affair with the 22-year-old Monica Lewinsky whilst he was married to Hillary, which of course pretty much ruined Monica's life. And I'm assuming his relationship with Hillary, I think that's something we're never going to know the truth about, but it is what it is. I'm sure we could dig so deep into that one. If you do want to hear more about his relationship with Monica, we did a whole episode on that in I believe our first season. So feel free to scroll back through the feed. But today I want to take a closer look at his affair with a woman named Jennifer Flowers. That's Jennifer with a G. A lot of people don't really know that this actually happened. So let's get into it. This gal is an author, singer, model, actress, and she used to work for the state of Arkansas. She was also a TV journalist. Now, during Clinton's 1992 election campaign, Flowers said that they had a 12-year relationship and that he'd gotten her a job with the state. At first, of course, Clinton denied having a relationship with her. He did this on 60 Minutes, which is an iconic interview. I really insist that you look it up. It's iconic because Hillary joins him. They sit comfortably, calmly as he lies through his teeth, and she sits next to him in support. And I have to say, and I think a lot of people have said this already, her presence there most likely secured his win.
Yeah.
Here's a particularly striking clip of Hillary vouching for him.
You know, I'm not sitting here as some little woman standing by my man like Tammy Wynette. I'm sitting here because I love him and I respect him and I honor what he's been through and what we've been through together. And you know, if that's not enough for people, then heck, don't vote for him.
Oof, 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 oof. Sarah, what do you make of that little clip there?
So, I mean, I think that Hillary Clinton really excels when she's in the hot seat. This is a woman who's just unflappable. She's made of steel. When she basically says she doesn't have a problem with her husband, you believe her, right?
Yeah.
And the world was much less media literate back then. Also, we didn't know Bill Clinton the way we do now. So I can see why people found her persuasive. There's a really great book that no one read by Curtis Sittenfeld, who is famous. You probably have heard of her book, Romantic Comedy, and maybe her retelling of Pride and Prejudice, Eligible. And this book is called Broadham, and it's an alternate history. It imagines what would have happened if Hillary Clinton had dated Bill but hadn't married him, right? How would her life have been different? And it's a fascinating alternative political history of the United States. I mean, just Curtis Sittenfeld is a political genius in addition to being a fantastic writer. She really would have been a great political strategist because everything she guesses would have happened. I've talked to political scientists who think, oh yeah, this probably would have happened.
Wow.
Anyway, she has this scene where a similar scandal happens to Bill Clinton when he's running for president, but he's not married to Hillary. He's married to someone else. And that person, when this comes out, buckles under the pressure and cries during the 60 Minutes interview, and then he loses. And Bush Sr. gets a second term, right? Which completely changes the trajectory of American politics.
Wow.
So I think everyone should read that book. It's a great book. I really enjoyed it. But I think that had he not been married to somebody who was so unflappable, just made of steel, this woman excels under pressure, it wouldn't have worked. It wouldn't have worked. And to this day, he doesn't really appreciate her sufficiently. I remember when she was running for president in 2016, he was acting as a campaign surrogate and doing interviews. And in one interview I watched with him, he was asked by the interviewer, do you think your wife's smarter than you? And at this point, he has nothing to lose. He's not running for president. Just say yes. Just say she's smarter. And he doesn't. He says about some things. And the example he gives is she's more organized than me.
Oh, God.
I'm like, it doesn't even matter if the president is organized because he has how many assistants, right? So who cares? It just, he still can't go to bat for her the way she did for him. And it infuriates me because if he'd been married to anyone else, he wouldn't have been president. And if she'd been married to anyone else, she might have been president.
That's really interesting. That's really interesting. I don't know how much I believe that. I will say I love me some Curtis Sittenfeld, and I've always avoided that book because I can't stand Hillary. And this is the first time, Sarah, and of course you are the one to do it, I feel convinced that I have to read this immediately because that's really fascinating. And I love a rewrite of history. That's really, really cool. And again, it confirms just how iconic this interview is. I really insist that for anyone listening, you go back and watch the whole thing. Now, soon after this interview, Flowers held a press conference, of course, in which she played tape recordings she'd secretly made of phone calls with Clinton, as one does. Now, listen, if you ever have an affair with a high-level politician, I also insist that you record everything. You never know if you're going to need it. Fun fact, on those tapes, Clinton also discussed then Governor of New York, Mario Cuomo, saying he acted like a mafioso. And after these tapes were revealed, Clinton issued a public apology to Cuomo. It's so funny to me that he was so quick to be sorry for that. But as we know, men are different with each other, aren't they?
Well, yeah. And to be fair, the Cuomos have collectively as a family done some really corrupt things. So this criticism was more warranted for sure.
Yeah. We should do a future Cuomo's episode, honestly. We could tackle the whole family. So what's interesting here to me is how desperately the media did not want any of this to be true. There were so many reports, all speculating that the tapes were doctored. And to be fair, they were not lab tested. Clinton's aides, James Carville and George Stephanopoulos, yes, that George, loved this theory naturally, and they doubled down on it. Now, what I find fun is that several years later, in a 2000 interview, Stephanopoulos admitted, quote, "Oh, it was absolutely his voice, but they were selectively edited in a way to create some impression." Okay, George. Now, it took 6 years before Bill came clean in January 1998 deposition in which he denied sexual allegations by another woman, Kathleen Willey. When it came to Jennifer Flowers, he testified under oath that he'd had a, quote, sexual encounter with her. And in his 2004 memoir, he insisted it was just one hookup. For the record, he doesn't use the word hookup, but I'm using that. Sarah, do you buy it? Also, why do you think this man is such a horn dog?
I mean, I think he has sex addiction, which is a real health problem, except it has also led him to assault people allegedly and to humiliate his wife again and again. And the problem is, if you have a sex addiction, but you also have an ambition addiction, like he's an ambition monster.
Ooh.
There are very few people in the history of the world who have been as ambitious as Bill Clinton was from the start. Everyone always says, like, he was ambitious from birth.
Right.
These things collide, and really the man needed therapy. And I mean, maybe it was just you couldn't help him. Like, I don't know. I do know that when you read the Carl Bernstein biography of Hillary Clinton, it's interesting because she was prepared for the infidelity. It didn't surprise her. That's what he argues by researching her. He says that when she agreed to marry him, Hillary's friends cautioned her and they said, you know, he'll never be faithful to you. He's just not capable of it. Everyone knew he was a sex addict, although I don't know if they used that term. And Hillary just said to them, I know, but I love him. So they kind of had I think it was a don't ask, don't tell deal.
Yeah.
Like, I think she went in with her eyes open, right? He, according to this book, which is a great book, the Carl Bernstein biography of Hillary Clinton, she was the love of his life. Perhaps the only woman he ever truly loved. But he was never going to stop sleeping with other women.
Yeah.
And she knew that and was okay with that, as long as it didn't interfere with their goals as a couple and their family. What happened with Monica Lewinsky was it just became impossible to brush off at that point, which is why, according to this biography, she considered divorcing him. It was just, there was so much pressure. She couldn't keep her pride, right? And she couldn't do the 60 Minutes interview again and just dismiss the allegations. But it is interesting that their marriage was, I wouldn't say it was open in the way we think of it today, but in some ways it was consensual non-monogamy because she just accepted that about him, that he would never be faithful.
That's so interesting. And, you know, I hate to be a cynic, but I often wonder too, especially all these years later, how much of them staying together has been a chess move on both sides in terms of just playing a good political game, quote unquote good.
You know what I find fascinating about Hillary Clinton is that she and her longtime aide, Huma Abedin, who we could do an interview on her. I'm just obsessed. They've had very similar lives. I mean, on different scales, but Huma was married to Anthony Weiner. I called her Huma like she's my friend, but I feel like she's my friend.
She is our friend.
She's our friend. Come on the show. Please. I read your memoir.
Same.
Anyway, they love watching The Good Wife together. And that surprises me because are they just sitting there thinking, okay, whose husband is this really based on? Yours or mine, right? Like, I guess it's relatable for them. They're the two people in the world who probably find the show the most relatable. But I would have thought that show would be too triggering for Hillary. But she loves it. So maybe she's more self-aware than we all know, or maybe she's just not self-aware at all, and that's why she loves it.
I mean, listen, there's still celebrities, right? There's always going to be a lack of self-awareness, and I do think if you want to be a politician, especially of that caliber, there is a part of you that likes a little bit of attention because you are a little bit of a performer. That's a huge, huge, huge part of the job, especially if you're going for the presidency. Now, back to Jennifer Flowers. While Hillary, for some reason, stays with Bill, he likely continues to step out. As for Jennifer Flowers, she sued much of the administration for defamation, but her case was eventually dismissed. She wrote her own memoir in 1995, another one soon after that. And even later than that, she ran her own cabaret show in New Orleans, which I think is fun. She did a little bit of acting. And in 2008, auctioned off some more Clinton tapes. She even supported Hillary during her 2008 presidential run. And
good for her.
Yeah, but then in 2016, I'm sorry to say, she supported Trump. Quite a turnaround. Yeah. So, Sarah, what do you make of her trajectory compared to Monica's? Because I think Jennifer certainly was sexualized by the media. There's no doubt about that.
Mm-hmm.
She definitely experienced a fair bit of sexism, a fair bit of I'll just leave that. I'll say that again. She definitely experienced a fair bit of sexism at the hand of the media. But I mean, she took the moment in the spotlight. She did what she could. She did what she wanted. But she still has become this footnote in Bill Clinton's history. And I think, unfortunately, as much as Monica has moved beyond that, her name is still so strongly associated with all of this. What do you make of these two in comparison to each other?
You're right. It is fascinating that the Monica Lewinsky scandal blew up so much, just, I mean, exponentially more than Jennifer Flowers or even Paula Jones.
Yes.
I think when it came to those scandals, you kind of at that point sort of think, where there's smoke, there's fire. He wasn't in the honeymoon stage anymore of being a politician and a president, right? I mean, I think that at that point, people were just ready to believe it. And the Republicans really wanted people to believe it, right?
Yeah.
They worked hard to make you believe it. There was a ton of evidence. Although with Jennifer Flowers, there was a good amount of evidence, right? They just claimed that the tapes were doctored, and the public really wanted to believe that, right? I mean, they probably wanted to say the same things about the tapes Monica Lewinsky was on, right?
Yeah.
But just at that point, I don't think there was enough goodwill left. There had been a lot of scandals. And that is true of, I mean, most American presidents. By the time they get into the second term, they've got a record. And even if there isn't a sex scandal, there's some stuff that they did that wasn't super popular. And it just, people don't give them the benefit of the doubt anymore if there is a scandal like that. So I think a lot of it is timing. I think also just people are so willing to dismiss women that they don't view as, for lack of a better word, classy, right?
Yeah.
Women who are dismissed as being, more common, right? Like there's an element of classism here, right?
Oh,
and Jennifer Flowers was a victim of that, as was Paula Jones. For sure, they were victims of that. When you have someone like Monica Lewinsky, she came from a wealthy family. She went to university. She was an intern. You can't just sort of dismiss it as, okay, even though, I mean, I don't think she wanted people to know the story, but you can't just sort of dismiss it as she's lying, she's trashy, because there was a lot of classism that benefited Clinton with the first two major scandals.
Sarah said it best. Again, check out our previous episode on Monica to get a little deeper into her, because we love her so much over here. But for our final presidential scandal, as if we haven't hit all the hot button issues, murder, assault, sex, I'm going to hit you with probably one of the heaviest ones. But I also just want this to be something that everybody knows about a little bit more. So let's get into it. And Sarah, I'm so curious for your thoughts on this. I want to discuss one of the more shockingly underrated ones. It involves Thomas Jefferson. So we're venturing a bit further back yet again. In fact, he was the third U.S. president.
Yeah, so this is the oldest. It's broken Lincoln's record. Lincoln had his record for about 15 minutes, and now he is being replaced by new record holder Thomas Jefferson.
There you go. So now, I mean, since he served, there's been debate over whether he had a sexual and or romantic relationship with his slave and sister-in-law, Sally Hemings, and therefore was father to some or all of her 6 children. That's a wallop, right? Now, prior to the 21st century, plenty of historians insisted he didn't have a slave called Sally. Because again, I think that was a lot of people hoping it just wasn't true. We've seen this time and time again. But since then, most agree he was certainly a father to her children. It also helped that in 1998, DNA analysis found a link between the Jeffersons and the Hemmings. So there you go. Cold hard truth. And it was consistent with Jefferson being the father to at least one of her kids. So, what is the truth? And is this the world yet again praying for a better president and just blind to fact? Let's get into it. So, Jefferson became a widower in 1782 when he was 39. He is believed to have begun an affair with Hemming sometime before 1789, which means she would have been 16. Now, many believe that it lasted almost 40 years until his death.
Wow.
He never commented on it publicly or privately. His daughter from his marriage did deny it at one point. Similarly, two of Hemming's children said it was true. Now, Hemmings was the child of a shadow family, and her children became the same. If you don't know what a shadow family is, it was considered children of a white male slave owner and black female slave. Rumor has long had it that Hemmings' father was actually Jefferson's father-in-law, who himself, stick with me here, had a 12-year relationship with his slave and had 6 children with her. It's a lot to digest. So you might be wondering, where does the controversy come in? Well, you probably already picked up on it, but here's where the tougher part of it all is. In her Pulitzer Prize-winning 2008 book, The Hemmingses of Monticello, An American Family, historian Annette Gordon-Reed writes, quote, "In all the venues I have visited, from Houston to Stockholm, one question always arises. Did they love each other?" She goes on to say, rape and the threat of it blighted the lives of countless enslaved women. At the same time, some black women and white men did form bonds quite different in character from those resulting from sexual coercion. So basically, the question here is, did they have a consensual relationship? Sarah, I'm so curious what you make of this. I think I already have a guess, but please share.
Well, I mean, you can't consent if you are enslaved, right? If somebody owns you, you can't consent. I mean, that's just the simple fact of the institution of slavery and how horrific it is. And if, he didn't ever give her freedom.
Yeah.
I don't think he did. I don't think he left her freedom.
He didn't.
And he certainly didn't give her freedom while she was alive. So, I mean, I have read a lot about this relationship, and I know that prior to sort of really, honestly, the Me Too movement, people would refer to Sally Hemings as Jefferson's mistress in American history. I mean, I've taken many courses in American history over the course of my life, and that's just the way that you were expected to refer to her, right? That there was no debate about it, at least not that I saw in mainstream American history discourse. So I'm happy that we're finally having this discussion and finally discussing the fact that, like, you can't consent to being someone's mistress. You're not their partner or their significant other if you are enslaved. And he definitely didn't give her the respect of a significant other. And I know back in the day, wives were less respected than they should be now. I know, like, a lot of people didn't even respect their legal wives, but this was a secret. He wasn't talking about it.
Exactly. That's my thing. He hid it. He hid it from his close friends to the general public. It's wild. And I think just the fact that the children are at odds with what they say says a lot. And mind you, yet again, she was underage. So it's one thing to have this master-slave dynamic where you can't consent, but she couldn't consent anyway. She was so young. She was a child. She was 2 decades younger than him.
Mm-hmm.
There's so much to dissect. Here. I mean, we could go on for hours. But one other thing I do want to touch on is that only 4 Hemmings kids survived to adulthood, and 3 of them chose to identify as white. They certainly were white passing. But I think that's certainly interesting. They lived in white communities. However, because their mother was a slave, they were born enslaved, even if their father was the fucking president, who, I'm going to directly say it here, very likely raped their mother for years. But wait, a kind of justice did come sort of. Eventually, Jefferson freed all of the Hemmings kids and no others in the family. And as Sarah pointed out already, he did not free Hemmings herself, though his daughter did after his death. I find this to be the most telltale point. Why did he free the children but he didn't free her? To me, it just says maybe she would have left him if he had done that. He felt like he needed to have that control. It's disgusting. What's more disgusting is that there is countless TV shows, TV movies out there, maybe even some books, I'm sure, that paint this as a very romantic relationship. If you see that in the content that you're pulling up, please run. Find something that's a little bit more factual. It's ridiculous. And fortunately, today historians are pushing and working on restoring the truth. For instance, Monticello, the home of Jefferson, is changing it up. In 1914, what was believed to be Sally's room, right by Jefferson's, had been turned into a bathroom out of shame. That's disgusting. But about a decade ago, the room was restored, and it was opened up to the public finally, as Krista Dirksheed, a Monticello historian, told the Washington Post in 2017, quote, "Visitors will come up here and understand that there was no place on this mountaintop that slavery was not. Thomas Jefferson was surrounded by people, and the vast majority of those people were enslaved." She doesn't directly say it, but she's certainly implying that was Sally's role. Sir, do you feel Sally's history has effectively been rewritten? Do some people still consider her Jefferson's concubine? Are they enough to sway the truth here?
No, I don't think it has been adequately rewritten. But I mean, neither has the entire sexual politics of the United States, right? Like, we still don't truly understand as a society the politics and culture of consent. There are still a lot of myths about it. There are a lot of people who have been told the truth about what informed consent looks like and still just choose not to believe it because they don't care. So I don't think we're there yet. And just even people in our generation, if they haven't been, active on social media and seeing posts about Sally Hemings and how you shouldn't refer to her as Jefferson's mistress, probably would just remember what they were told in history textbooks when they were kids and would just think of her that way, right? Because no one has corrected that view for them. So I think we're a long way away from having justice for Sally Hemings. I mean, maybe it will happen in the future. I even think now there's just such a backlash against the Me Too movement and this attempt to reclaim the stories of women who have been abused by powerful men, that if in some ways it's worse than it was 5 years ago, right? I think that there are probably a lot of people who really just want to view her as the mistress and excuse everything Jefferson did to her.
Yeah, it's certainly more romantic, but it just doesn't add up. I think a lot of you will probably know a little bit about this from Scandal, the Shonda Rhimes show, because at one point it is referenced. I don't want to get into all of that because it's thorny, but I think that says a lot about the different ways in which people have come to view this relationship and why there's still not a really firm grasp on it. But I don't know. It's certainly interesting. I think what makes me sad is it seems like it's still a radical idea to see that she was assaulted through much of her life and that this was not a relationship that she chose. But that wraps up our looks back into history. Quite heavy. But before we leave you, I want to jump into our final segment. Hindsight is 2024, where we choose the one moment that we might have handled differently if we were the subject of these stories. I think it's hard for this episode, but Sarah, what would you say?
Oh my goodness. It's hard to pick one moment from 4 scandals.
It's a lot of fuck ups.
I don't know. If I were Hillary Clinton, I definitely would have left Bill when the Jennifer Flowers thing came out and then tried to run for Senate. I don't know if she would have for sure succeeded in becoming president if she divorced him. But even if she hadn't, I feel like because she's very smart, her career trajectory would have been similar to what she did achieve, Secretary of State, a senator. So she might as well have done it without having to also do the emotional labor of propping him up every time he messed up.
Yes.
So that's what I would do differently. Otherwise, it's really hard to pick. I mean, obviously, Trump shouldn't have assaulted women, but this person is, in my opinion, and I'm not a psychologist, a psychopath. So he's not going to listen to me.
I completely agree on all these counts. There's so many things we could say. This person, I wish they hadn't done it. I think men are so often terrible throughout history. So I'm glad we're pointing all of that out. But yeah, I think the big one for me, hilariously, is that I just wish Hillary had not joined Bill for that 60 Minutes interview. I gotta go read that Curtis Sinfield book. But alas, that brings us to the end of this episode. Thank you to our talented editor, Evan Wexler. And of course, thank you to all our beautiful listeners. You can listen to more of The Reheat for free on the Seeker app. You can also find the show on the Frequency Podcast Network or wherever you get your podcasts. If you want to hear more from me, you can find me at _Sadaf Aslan. Sarah, where can our listeners find you?
Listeners can find me at Sarah Sahagian. And if you liked this podcast, please rate, review, and subscribe so other listeners can find us too. And if you'd like us to keep growing, we'd love for you to support us at Patreon at patreon.com/thereheat, where we've got some goods in store for you. Thanks for listening.
Go vote.
Céline Dion.
My dream to be international star.
Could it happen again? Could Celine Dion happen again?
I'm Thomas Leblanc, and Celine Understood is a 4-part series from CBC Podcasts and CBC News, where I piece together the surprising circumstances that helped manufacture Celine Dion, the pop icon. Celine Understood, available wherever you get your podcasts.